Hi, all. Welcome to part three of our introduction to the podcast, History Comes Alive with Jeff Nichols. Before we get started today, just a couple of quick notes. The first thing is we did launch a YouTube channel this week. So the first two videos that we've already done, this one, and then a couple of more, probably springboarding from this one, shorter format, will be loaded up on there within the next couple of days. So the focus is really going to be historical examples of what fidelity looks like to the truths and the facts and the events of history. I think that it's important to develop these concepts for each of us to make better choices in our lives, wherever we happen to be, with whatever we happen to face, based on our own personal convictions. So the deeper and the wider our personal convictions are through knowledge, the more settled and stable and confident we're going to be. We'll make better decisions. So we want to work through the events of history and its players, because understanding those things puts more tools in our toolbox. So we want to build on the concepts that we've previously discussed. First of all, you remember we asked the question, what's the role of government? Not just conceptually, but inside of the confines of the Constitutional Republic of the United States of America. We want to understand that then through the lens of those who have made and shaped the history of our country. We began to develop the difference between the trivial, things that may be familiar with no real depth of understanding, kind of empty believism, versus really knowing and understanding something, being pregnant with data to support a well-considered view on any particular subject. All of that, of course, is tied to the question, who frames your argument? Where did you get your beliefs from and your doctrine and the things that you will stand or fall on? You remember, we recognized through Socrates' allegory of the cave that we can have very strong aversion to new information, especially if it confronts our worldview. There's a danger of filtering information if it's simply to filter out information in order to sanitize and defend our current position. I mean, there's a liberty that's found in knowledge and gaining more knowledge and understanding and application. Gives you peace of mind. Frankly, peace of mind is probably the most valuable possession any one of us can have. The problem is that we can become so comfortable suffering no real consequence for our positions here in our great nation that we forget, or maybe we never learn, how precious a commodity that confidence from preparation really is. I mean, ideas have consequences. We understand this in the physical world. I mean, if we hit our thumb with a hammer, we immediately are confronted with the reality of the pain that comes along with hitting our thumb with a hammer. We immediately are confronted with the pain sometimes that comes with our own actions. And we learn as quickly as possible how to avoid that pain with a hammer. We're not so quick to understand this in the metaphysical world. I mean, everybody's opinion is not equal. Some things are predictable, and their results are evidenced by what has happened before. We can't see the wind, but we can see and we can feel and experience the wind. We see its effects all around us. It's there no matter we visually see the wind or not. In a lot of ways, that's like the lessons of history. So again, what's the role of government as it impacts and shapes the interest of men, as it provokes them to action? I mean, what do you really know about American history? How do you know? Or more aptly, I guess we could ask, how do you apply what you know from history? How do you process what you know when the information comes in? I mean, do your decisions confirm wisdom or expose your ignorance to history? Is your knowledge nothing more than some robotic regurgitation that somebody else said? Is it emotionless and sterile in the sense that you really don't know why you believe or why you say what you say? Because you can know a lot about something and have no passion. You can have no intimacy and no fidelity with the facts. The focus of my question today then is on the concept of fidelity, faithfulness. And it's a concept that I spend a lot of time working through in my own mind. The concept of the fidelity to an idea or to a principle. I mean, being sold out for a cause or for a purpose to the point of personal loss if need be. Most of us lack this, and frankly, most situations in life really aren't worthy of fidelity. Who cares what kind of peaches you buy? But to me, the practice of fidelity constructively is to answer the question, which hill or hills are you willing to die on? I mean, when push comes to shove, what are you willing to fight for? Now, if you've got too many items on that list, you misunderstood the question. Fidelity comes through intimacy. I mean, without intimacy to a particular subject or topic, you're more likely, if we can use some human analogies, you're more likely to experience lust than you are love. You're more likely to experience something fleeting rather than timeless. You're experiencing infatuation and not exactly fidelity. Now, those positions, the concept of infatuation or fidelity, lust or love, or something fleeting versus something more permanent, they can look the same when all things are going well, but one of those positions renders you weak in a time of crisis. And one of those positions will embolden and strengthen you. The older I get, the more my fidelity to actual knowledge grows. Real things, not hypocrisy and not trivia. I mean, frankly, we're usually on autopilot. Most things that we experience require nothing more than just autopilot rotation, right? I mean, a good example of that for most of us is our jobs or our careers. Once we become well-trained and competent, we spend most of our waking moments there, and most of that just becomes rote resuscitation every day. Now, the thing about our careers and our jobs is that for most of us, how we carry out our job has very little effect on most other people in society. Our understanding and application of history, however, does have an impact. Let me ask you, can you walk through a series of events and realize the relationships between the interchangeable parts? Can you see the interdependence of all of the different moving parts? Think about a puzzle, a 1,000-piece puzzle thrown upon the floor, pieces all over the place. Every one of those pieces represents a little piece of something, right? A bigger picture. Now think about the same puzzle assembled and sitting on your table. You know, that's the same puzzle either way. Are you able to look at the pieces and make sense of the bigger picture, the more complete picture? How much more valuable is the larger picture than those individual pieces when the puzzle's finished? You know, history is a lot like a puzzle. It's best understood when we have assembled as many of the pieces as possible. Is it more useful to know all of the pieces, the specifics, the names, the dates, the places of history? Or do you think it's more useful to know the concepts? Because concepts are not situationally exclusive, right? Concepts can be applied over and over and over again to generate relatively predictable results. Let's build on that concept for a minute. Let's develop and make sure that we're on the same page, because again, this is the introduction to the podcast. I won't constantly be telling you how to critically think or how I'm critically assessing information. I'm just merely going to present it. But I want to make sure that we're on the same page. So I wanted to use a couple of common examples today before we do just a little bit of a history teaching. So let's think about when we learn to walk. Right? Learning to walk is really a matter of mechanics, balance and coordination and muscular ability. And that's coupled with the desire to move independently. Now, once the mechanics are mastered, walking becomes very utilitarian. The benefit and the utility of walking is not in the mechanics itself, but it's in the mobility that it affords. Maybe a better or a broader example can be found in the illustration of football. I should say American football. A good football coach is generally successful again and again and again, if they're allowed to operate without front office and administrative experience. A good coach appears to be able to duplicate success in spite of changing talent levels, trades, injuries, personalities. The players don't make the coach. Now, obviously, there's a chemistry factor, and there are key players on every squad, but the culture has to be driven by the coach. And good coaches are able to get more out of their squads than their counterparts on a regular basis. Good coaches do two things. They do what they do well, and they take away their opponent's strength. Good coaches frame the argument better than their opponents do. It's not an easy task to achieve. I mean, it requires some honesty and self-reflection. It's the ability to recognize the difference between what you want to do and at any given time, what you really can do, what can you achieve. And then being able to sell that plan to your staff, whether it's the other coaches on staff or the players themselves. The various special teams coaches, they're experts in very specific areas. But the head coach alone is tasked with coordinating all of those pieces into a larger cohesive unit, something extraordinary. Not all coaches are good at this. Not all smart guys are good leaders. Not all good leaders are necessarily smart guys outside of their respective craft. It's the concepts that are emphasized, the strategy itself, the fundamentals of the coach's mindset, the various moving parts that work together to make the whole thing a whole lot better, right? It's like the various pieces of that puzzle we were talking about. Or the difference between the mechanics of walking and the utility of the mobility that it provides. This model can be duplicated over a variety of life's activities. It could be family, social, civil. It could be the exercise of military operations or politics or business, or even our approach to history. Like Plato's allegory of the cave, the message is bigger than the men that are trapped in that cave. The takeaway transcends the individual. The takeaway transcends generation and culture and even a specific society. Situations are unique, but concepts can be almost universally understood. They have the power to affect change. Oftentimes, it's only those that have experienced something beyond the popular, something extraordinary, that really have the courage to stand against the current. Those that have experienced the extraordinary make history. And I want to know what that was when I'm reading about the men of history. Back in school, I always loved history. Social studies, they called it back then. I think it's global or world studies or something now. I always liked literature too. Now, don't misunderstand me. I didn't like English and grammar, and you can tell by the way I use English and grammar, I probably should have paid attention more. But I loved literature because literature is the recorded observations and expressions of other people captured in their own words, from their own perspective, from their own time and place in history. It's fascinating. Now, these two subjects, social studies and literature, they largely existed like two parallel tracks for me, running side by side, but never merging or intersecting. until I read some of the great literature of the 19th century. The reality of human nature, the frailty, the depravity, the self-serving, self-glorifying nature of man, coupled and mingled with the beauty and the courage and the resiliency of the human spirit. Dostoevsky's universal nature that I saw in novels like The Idiot. Kafka's graphic ugliness. Camus' subtlety of how ugly and universal human nature can actually be. And Hawthorne's expositions over and over and over again about the hypocrisy. Well, it was through these men and their observations, their collective voices, that the concepts of human nature and history collided. And the people of the history books, the stories that I had read, came alive. History, as I read it, is the combination of human nature and human action, a collision of will and opportunity. Intentional history makers are those among us that are willing to forsake everything. They're willing to forsake comfort, reputation, standing for the things that they believe in. In them, we witness firsthand the collision of will and opportunity. The illustrations over and over and over again of Washington's interest, if you'll remember. Some of these collisions are so big that they change the status quo. They make Washington's grazing multitude pay attention. These collisions have the capacity to move entire nations, to change the course of history. Now, although we may go decades, generations without witnessing men of this caliber, the closing decades of colonial America was home to hundreds of this rare breed, if not thousands. The birth of the United States of America is one of the most exciting, transformational, improbable experiments in societal history. The concept that the government exists for the good of the people, for their benefit, when it's practically applied. Now, I realize, and I've mentioned a few times now, that there are legitimate questions about the founders' motives. We'll be looking at those as the weeks and months progress. But the results of the experiment, the accomplishments, speak for themselves. At the conclusion of the American Revolution, those living in the former 13 colonies were not recognized as subjects, but as citizens. It's a very interesting debate. I mean, what does it mean to be a citizen? Self-determined, autonomous. Imagine asking that question back then in a world that was dominated by monarchies, autocrats, dictators, men and women who ruled largely unchecked. It should go without saying, but as a disclaimer, the human rights movements and the controversies around topics like slavery or suffrage, we're going to address those as they chronologically happened in our history. Neither the founders or successive generations or even our own generation have fully figured some of these things out. Now, some of the criticism of the American system is fair. Some of it is not. The culmination of the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Age of Enlightenment produced two related, bold new concepts: the importance and the value of the individual, and representative government on a grand scale. What does that even mean? How are we supposed to understand those concepts in context? I mean, we're born into a system generations, centuries old at this point. We have no other point of reference. It's tough to imagine how radical a concept that really was, and it still is in so many places around the world. So no matter what your specific views are, the concepts of self-determination and representative government should make you breathe very deep. Granting liberty, a large measure of self-determination to the masses, was at that time and still is a very bold move. I mean, consider what that really means. Think about this. Now, this is important. What are you expecting to receive from your neighbor? What are you extending or granting to your neighbor in return under our social contract? You and your neighbor are allowed, you're permitted to believe contrary to one another without fear of reprisal. It's not that way in many parts of the world. Do you believe, as a culture, that we still believe in individual liberty? I mean, as the founders and subsequent generations understood it. And be honest when you answer that. Do you believe that we still, as a culture, believe in individual liberty? The question could be rephrased. Should we still believe in individual liberty, as the founders and subsequent generations understood it? What are the alternatives? If we take the issues of slavery and suffrage off the table. Now notice I didn't say the system was or is perfect. I asked if the template was still relative or has the experiment run its course? What's the reasonable alternative? It can be changed. It's evolved over time. Like Plato, there are many who can help shape our views about the nature of man in general and about social conduct more specifically. I mean, they can offer challenges to what we take for granted, to what we live with, what we accept as normal and rational. There are those rare folks who do not leave their loyal audiences amused, but changed and different. These are the people that I love to explore, the people that I want to talk about. There's the compelling story of a young man of 22 years that really highlights the concept, my approach to history and how to understand it, to learn about history and then to apply it to my own life. Now imagine this. The place is New Orleans, and it's early 19th century, and the scene is a slave auction. Imagine witnessing the scene as described by historian Paul Johnson, picking up somewhere in the middle of the story, but you'll get the context. I want to read this. It's kind of an extended quote, if you'll forgive me. Paul Johnson wrote, "All Northerners knew or believed that the male slave owners slept with their pretty female slaves, and often bought them with this in mind. One young man, aged 22, and on his second trip to New Orleans, saw a young, beautiful teenage black girl, guaranteed a virgin, being sold. The leering auctioneer declared, 'The gentleman who buys her will get good value for his money.' The girl was virtually naked, and the horrific scene made a deep impression on the young man. Southerners denied that they fornicated with their female slaves, but they also, contradicting themselves, accused their northern tormentors of sexual envy, which may have been true in some cases. Now think about the reality of that culture. Never mind the social or political, the doctrinal debates and states' rights and centralized government. Think about the reality of the culture, of witnessing the horrific concept of a slave auction under those situations. Do you have female relatives? Do you care about any women in your life? To further develop the scene and to develop this 22-year-old witness just a little bit more, another historian commenting on this young man, David Herbert Donald, spoke of this man's personal temperament, how he was described by those who knew him best. This young man of 22 years was said to have had, quote, a distrust of intimacy and an unwillingness to confide in others. Sounds kind of cold. He was self-assured. This young man it was said that he possessed, quote, a reliance on his own abilities that made it almost impossible to bend and to seek help from others whom he knew to be intellectually inferior. That's a broad statement. This man's secretary once said, quote, it's absurd to call him a modest man. And he went on to say, quote, "No great man was ever modest. It was his intellectual arrogance and unconscious assumption of superiority that some men could never forgive." That's quite a statement. And again, from historian David Herbert Donald, quote, "It is certain that on some basic issues, no advice from any friend, no suggestion from experience would have altered his policies." Lastly, from this man's own wife, who stated, quote, "A terribly firm man when he set his foot down. None of us, no man and no woman could rule him after he made his mind up." This man's life was also marked by many failures. The experience in New Orleans stayed with him all of his life. To him, it was more than a prick of the conscience. It was more than conviction. It was moral indignation. There's an old country song by Aaron Tippin. If you'll excuse me for a moment, I'll read the lyrics to you. I think it presses our point. Aaron Tippin once sang a song and he said, quote, "Now Daddy didn't like trouble, but if it came along, everyone that knew him knew which side that he'd be on. He never was a hero or this county's shining light, but you could always find him standing up for what he thought was right. He'd say, you've got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything. You've got to be your own man, not a puppet on a string. Never compromise what's right and uphold your family name. You've got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything." And he continues, "Now we might have been better off or owned a bigger house if Daddy'd done more giving in or a little more backing down. But we always had plenty, just living his advice. Whatever you do today, you'll have to live with tonight." These lyrics draw such a common man's example of integrity and a strong moral compass, honesty, courage, bravery, easy speech that sometimes must be backed up by action. Do we live this way? What do you believe in your core? I mean, to what extent, to what lengths, and what cost are you willing to stand for the things that you claim to believe in? How much do you understand them? These days, men appear to be men without chests, oftentimes. That is to say, they're shallow and they're without real conviction. They're ruled by emotion and the wind of the day, the flavor of the day. They're indecent. They're so caught up in their own pleasures and their own sense of entitlement, for whatever that may be, that they either can no longer be trusted to do the right thing, or worse, they will not do the right thing. They've never been inspired to do so. Bicker, yes. Throw stones, absolutely. But critically work through an issue and take a stand for what's right, not on your life. Now, if you're listening to this and have even a clue as to what's going on around us, you know what I just said is true. Men who make history live by the lyrics of Aaron Tippin's song. They stand for something. They suffer loss if need be. They may not always uphold their family names. I mean, there's just as many determined scoundrels as heroes. And that's why it's so imperative for people to work through the issues themselves. Careful consideration of an issue may not change your view, but it can sometimes allow you to understand the other side, to be firmer in your own convictions, to have real confidence. Now, I'm not making a judgment call on any particular position. I'm talking about the absolute dedication that men who are true change agents demonstrate to achieve their goals. Particular character traits good or bad, of the individual and their connotations that they carry with them can matter very little in the hindsight of history. Let me ask you this. Would you be more inclined to follow a rumored womanizer, a known drunk, or a strong leader that's known to practice fidelity to one woman and abstains from alcohol? I'll ask the same question another way. Would you be more inclined to follow Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, or Adolf Hitler? Roosevelt was a rumored womanizer and Churchill was a drunk. You see, in the end, the character flaws or the strengths can matter very little. I mean, name a real change agent who was not plagued with certain flaws, certain predispositions, just like the rest of us. Many times their flaws are noted by their contemporaries, only to be ignored later after they have achieved their goal and a sense of immortality. Well, the experience of the young man in New Orleans who witnessed the reality of the slave auction firsthand set in motion a determination to act. He stood for something. He was prepared to sacrifice his bigger house when the opportunity came along. With all of his noted character flaws, with a lifetime of failures and disappointments, he acted on his convictions. And as you might have guessed, that young man was Abraham Lincoln. Headstrong and stubborn, deliberate, unreasonable, dedicated, goal-oriented, arrogant, would not listen to inferior people's advice. Abraham Lincoln was no man's puppet. Those same noted personality traits that seemed so negative at first seem very positive in hindsight, don't they? Those past failures, and there were many failures in Abraham Lincoln's life, they built an endurance and a courage in the face of opposition that few men ever achieve. Abraham Lincoln stood for something. He exercised fidelity towards a goal, steadfastness and devotion. He risked it all, and it cost him everything, and he changed the world. Look at the impact that auction had for all of us. The undeniable conviction that it produced. The action when opportunity presented itself. It split families and whole communities. It nearly split our nation in half. The story of Abraham Lincoln's inspiring, and it's more compelling the more that you know. All of history is. In Lincoln, we recognize specific things. Abraham Lincoln illustrates the perfect combination of experience and will, the collision of conviction and opportunity, the collision that didn't just move a nation, it changed the course of human history. His story inspires us because it registers on a deeper level. The human experience, the common human experience, is so similar. I mean, we may never be heroes or a county's shining light, as Aaron Tippin said, but we're all molded and we're shaped by our personal experiences. We're inspired by men like Abraham Lincoln because in him we find the motivation and the courage to stand for our values even when crisis comes. But to be inspired, we must learn from others. The more we know, the less likely we are to be someone's puppet. We can exercise our own self-determination with a little more confidence. Just a few reminders before we say goodbye for today. As I said, we're probably going to have a few smaller, more anecdotal videos to accompany this one. Things I didn't quite include here today. We have started a YouTube channel. We're going to be posting the videos on the YouTube channel. Website's coming very quickly. We are also on Facebook and Instagram and on LinkedIn. I'll be adding some blogs very soon, so I hope that you'll take the time to read those as well. And I can't tell you how much your likes and your shares and your encouragement means to myself and to Nathan and to John and all of the guys that are kind of helping me out with this project. So please continue to do so. Reach out to us directly and interact with us. We're going to be launching the actual podcast very soon. It will be on American history. And although I'll be starting the series in the very early 17th century, I'm not planning on mentioning Jamestown for a very long time, if ever, in the podcast series itself. We're going to be studying and looking at some other places geographically than Jamestown, places that I think are just as important and possibly more so than what we generally think about as the beginning of the 13 American colonies and civilization and the culture as we know it today. I do hope that you will join us. And I hope that you bring some friends. I think that we've got a little bit of something for just about everybody.